The story of the British Empire did not begin with grand strategies or master plans. It did not spring fully formed from the mind of kings or ministers. Instead, it began with fragile settlements, desperate gambles, and ventures that seemed more likely to collapse than to endure. In the 16th century, England was a modest kingdom on the fringes of Europe. Its population was far smaller than that of France or Spain, and its resources could not rival the wealth flowing into Iberia from the Americas. Yet in these years of apparent weakness, seeds were sown that would one day grow into an empire spanning the globe. The late 1500s were an age of contest and opportunity. Spain and Portugal dominated the seas. Their fleets brought silver from the mines of Potosi, spices from the East Indies, and gold from West Africa. Their kings ruled not just European lands, but overseas dominions that stretched across oceans. England, by contrast, was poor and vulnerable, still emerging from the turbulence of the Reformation and years of dynastic uncertainty. But under Queen Elizabeth I, the realm began to look outward. It was not an empire they sought at first, but survival, profit, and prestige. Men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins set sail not as empire builders in the conventional sense, but as opportunists, adventurers, and privateers. They probed the edges of the Spanish monopoly, raiding galleons heavy with treasure, mapping coastlines, and testing whether England might find a place in this new global order. These voyages carried enormous risk. Ships could founder, supplies could rot, and storms could scatter fleets. Many expeditions failed, yet each one pushed the horizon of possibility a little further. The attempt to establish colonies followed naturally from these ventures. But England's early efforts were far from promising. The colony at Roanoke, founded in the 1580s on the coast of what is now North Carolina, vanished without a trace. Its settlers either perished or were absorbed into native communities, leaving only the word Croton carved into a post as a ghostly clue to their fate. Other ventures fared little better. In 1607, Jamestown was planted in Virginia by the Virginia Company, a joint stock corporation of merchants and courtiers. Disease, famine, and conflict with the local Powhatan peoples almost destroyed it. In the first years, starvation was so severe that colonists resorted to eating rats, shoe leather, and, according to grim accounts, even the bodies of the dead. Out of 500 settlers who arrived in 1609, barely 60 survived the winter. What is striking, then, is not the strength of these beginnings, but their fragility. Colonization was not inevitable, nor was it clearly destined for success. Each settlement was an experiment, teetering between survival and collapse. But even in their failures, they laid foundations. Jamestown eventually stabilized, thanks to the cultivation of tobacco, a crop that transformed from curiosity to economic lifeline. Demand for tobacco in Europe made Virginia profitable, attracting further waves of settlers. It is here that we begin to see the peculiar character of the British Empire. Unlike the Spanish or Portuguese empires, which were more tightly directed by their monarchs, the English overseas ventures were often driven by corporations and individuals. The Virginia Company, the East India Company, and later the Hudson's Bay Company were chartered not by government ministries, but by monarchs granting extraordinary powers to private investors. These companies could wage war, coin money, govern territories, and establish trade monopolies. From the very beginning, the British Empire was a hybrid creation, part business, part state, rooted in commerce as much as conquest. Religion, too, played a powerful role. The Protestant Reformation had left England isolated from Catholic Europe, and overseas expansion carried a missionary zeal. Some settlers sought to spread Protestant Christianity to indigenous peoples, while others, like the Puritans of New England, crossed the Atlantic to escape persecution and build their own communities of faith. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, carrying with them visions of a new society shaped by their ideals. Though small in number, their story would loom large in the mythology of both Britain and America. Trade routes began to form. English merchants sought entry into markets dominated by Iberian powers. They established footholds along the coast of West Africa, trading for gold, ivory, and, increasingly, enslaved people. They reached into the Mediterranean, the Levant, and beyond. In 1600, the chartering of the East India Company marked a turning point. This corporation began humbly, seeking spices in competition with the Portuguese and Dutch. But it would one day wield armies, topple rulers, and govern millions. The 17th century brought turbulence and opportunity. England itself was racked by civil war in the 1640s, when monarchy and parliament clashed in a conflict that reshaped the state. Even in this period of domestic upheaval, colonial ventures continued. Barbados and other Caribbean islands were seized and planted with sugar, their plantations foreshadowing a brutal new economy built on enslaved African labor. New settlements arose in New England, Maryland, and along the American coast, diversifying the empire's transatlantic holdings. It is important to understand how precarious these ventures remained. Colonists were vulnerable to disease, dependent on supply ships, and entangled in conflicts with indigenous peoples whose own societies were resilient and adaptive. Native alliances and resistance shaped the course of colonial survival. Without the assistance of indigenous crops, trade, and knowledge, many colonies might have failed altogether. Yet as years passed, populations grew, economies stabilized, and fragile outposts hardened into enduring presences. By the late 1600s, England's position in the Atlantic world was stronger than ever. The Navigation Acts, passed by Parliament, sought to channel colonial trade through English ports, enriching merchants and strengthening the navy. Colonies supplied raw materials like tobacco, sugar, and timber, while consuming English-manufactured goods. A system was taking shape, one in which colonies and commerce reinforced one another, feeding into a global network of trade. But nothing about this trajectory was certain. The Dutch and the French were fierce rivals, contesting every trade route and coastline. Wars in Europe spilled into the Americas and the oceans, as fleets clashed and colonies changed hands. For every colony that prospered, others failed. For every venture that yielded riches, another drained coffers. The empire's survival depended not on inevitability, but on constant struggle, improvisation, and adaptation. And yet, looking back, it is precisely this fragile beginning that makes the later story so remarkable. From scattered settlements on vulnerable coastlines, from companies pursuing profit in distant seas, from men whose motives were often greed and desperation, something larger began to take shape. The English overseas presence expanded not by grand design, but by cumulative momentum. Each foothold, however precarious, opened possibilities for the next. Each profit, however small, enticed further risk. By the end of the 17th century, England was no longer a marginal player. Its merchants were active across the Atlantic, its colonies were growing in population, and its navy was emerging as a formidable force. The empire that had begun as a fragile experiment was taking root. The next century would transform it further, as sugar, slavery, and silver bounded into the brutal circuits of global trade. But at its core, the empire's origins remained what they had always been: fragile, improvised, and opportunistic, an empire born not of certainty, but of gamble. By the dawn of the 17th century, the fragile outposts England had carved into the New World were beginning to stabilize. Tobacco plantations in Virginia, small farms in New England, and settlements in the Caribbean had survived their earliest hardships. But it was not tobacco, nor timber, nor fish that would transform England's overseas holdings into a lucrative empire. It was sugar, a crop so valuable, so addictive, and so labor-intensive that it would reshape the Atlantic world, enrich the empire beyond measure, and bind it irreversibly to one of the darkest chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar was not a discovery. It had been cultivated for centuries in Asia and introduced to Europe by returning crusaders in the Middle Ages. By the 15th century, the Portuguese had experimented with growing it on Atlantic islands such as Madeira and São Tomé, using enslaved African labor. When Europeans reached the Caribbean, with its tropical climate and fertile soil, they found conditions perfectly suited for sugarcane. By the 1600s, Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua had become landscapes dominated by vast plantations. For England, these islands became jewels of profit. Sugar quickly became the most valuable commodity of the age. In London, Bristol, and Liverpool, merchants grew wealthy from their trade. Refined sugar was not merely a sweetener. It was a status symbol, a luxury item for Europe's growing middle classes, and eventually a staple of daily life, consumed in tea, baked goods, and rum. But behind the gleaming crystals of sugar lay immense suffering. The cultivation of cane was grueling and relentless. Fields had to be cleared, planted, and harvested by hand. Cane stalks were cut with machetes under a scorching sun, then crushed in mills before their juice spoiled. The work demanded brutal discipline, long hours, and constant replenishment of labor. European indentured servants, initially used on plantations, could not meet these demands. Disease, exhaustion, and desertion took their toll. Planters turned increasingly to enslaved Africans, purchased from coastal traders in West Africa and transported across the Atlantic in voyages that became infamous as the Middle Passage. This was the triangular trade, a system as profitable as it was inhuman. English ships left ports laden with textiles, firearms, and manufactured goods. These were exchanged in Africa for enslaved men, women, and children, captured in raids or sold by local rulers. The captives were then forced aboard slave ships for the Atlantic crossing. Packed into holds with little air, food, or water, they endured weeks of unimaginable horror. Disease, abuse, and despair killed many before they ever reached the Americas. Historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million Africans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries, with Britain responsible for carrying more than 3 million of them. Those who survived the Middle Passage were sold in auctions, branded, and forced into plantation labor. Families were torn apart, identities erased, languages suppressed. Enslaved Africans worked from dawn until nightfall, often under the lash of overseers. Mortality rates were so high that plantation owners relied on a constant influx of new captives to replace those who died. The Caribbean became a graveyard as much as a workshop, yet the profits were staggering. By the late 17th century, sugar was England's most valuable import. Fortunes were made, not only in the Caribbean, but also in the port cities of Britain. Merchants built grand houses. Banks and insurance firms grew rich on financing voyages and insuring slave cargoes. Even institutions that still exist today, from Lloyd's of London to certain universities, trace part of their wealth to these trades. The wealth of the empire was being built not just on commerce, but on chains. Resistance, however, was constant. Enslaved people refused to accept their fate passively. They sabotaged equipment, feigned illness, fled into the hills, and formed maroon communities that waged guerrilla warfare against colonial authorities. In Jamaica, Maroons fought the British to a standstill, forcing treaties that granted them autonomy. In Barbados and elsewhere, rebellions erupted, brutally suppressed but never extinguished. Each act of resistance revealed the fragility beneath the empire's profits, a reminder that coercion could never wholly erase the human will to be free. The impact of sugar and slavery rippled outward. In West Africa, the demand for captives fueled wars and destabilized societies. States like Dahomey and Ashanti expanded their power by raiding neighbors for captives to sell to Europeans. Entire regions were depopulated, their social fabric torn apart. In the Americas, plantation economies transformed landscapes, replacing forests with cane fields, driving ecological change as well as human misery. In Britain itself, the growing wealth from sugar and slavery fed into industrial and urban growth. By the 18th century, sweetened tea had become a staple of the working classes, while rum fueled taverns and naval rations alike. The empire's economy, society, and culture were tied by invisible threads to the suffering of Africans across the ocean. Silver, too, played its role in this Atlantic world. Though Britain never controlled the great mines of Spanish America, it benefited indirectly from the torrents of silver flowing from Potosi in Mexico. Silver underpinned global trade, circulating from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia. British merchants tapped into this system, exchanging manufactured goods for colonial products, using silver to settle deficits with Asia, and thus inserting themselves into the world economy. The empire's growing involvement in banking and credit meant that profits from sugar and slaves were multiplied through finance, feeding into a cycle of reinvestment and expansion. It was in this period that Britain began to emerge as a dominant player in the Atlantic system, competing fiercely with France, the Netherlands, and Spain. Naval wars were fought not only over European politics, but also over control of lucrative colonies. The capture of Jamaica from Spain in 1655 proved a turning point, establishing Britain's long-term Caribbean stronghold. By the early 18th century, Britain's slave ships dominated the trade from West Africa, and its sugar islands generated wealth that rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of its mainland American colonies. The moral contradictions of this system were not lost on contemporaries. Religious dissenters, particularly Quakers, began to speak against the inhumanity of slavery. Some Enlightenment thinkers questioned the ethics of human bondage in an age that celebrated liberty and reason. Yet these voices were drowned out by the roar of profit. Parliament itself granted monopolies to the Royal African Company, ensuring that the traffic in enslaved Africans was not merely tolerated but actively sanctioned by the state. For those who lived under it, however, the empire was not an abstraction but a daily struggle. In the Caribbean, the life expectancy of an enslaved laborer was measured in years, not decades. In West Africa, villages were razed, and families were shattered by the hunger of European traders. In Britain, consumers sipped tea sweetened by blood, often without thought for its origins. This dissonance between the wealth and comfort enjoyed by some and the misery endured by others lay at the heart of the empire's rise. By the mid-18th century, the scale of Britain's involvement in slavery and sugar had become immense. The so-called Sugar Triangle linked England, Africa, and the Caribbean in a cycle of trade that was both efficient and cruel. It created an empire of ports: Bristol, Liverpool, and London, their docks crowded with ships, their warehouses filled with goods. It created an empire of plantations stretching across the Caribbean, each one a microcosm of brutality. It created an empire of finance, with banks, insurers, and investors all tied to the fate of this trade. The story of the British Empire cannot be told without this chapter. Sugar, slaves, and silver were not side notes, but central pillars. They transformed a marginal European kingdom into a global power. They laid the economic foundations for the Industrial Revolution that would soon follow, and they left scars that remain visible in the modern world. In the diaspora of African peoples across the Atlantic, in the inequalities between nations, and in the memory of suffering endured for profit. If the empire had begun in fragility and gamble, it was now fueled by an engine of immense wealth. But wealth built on chains carries within it a contradiction. The enslaved resisted. Critics at home began to speak louder. Rival empires contested every shipment and colony. And soon, across the ocean, In Britain's mainland colonies of North America, tensions were rising that would test the empire in new ways. The 18th century opened with the British Empire at a crossroads. Its early ventures into the Atlantic world and the scattered footholds in Asia had provided the foundations for something larger, but nothing was guaranteed. Rival empires, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch, each pursued their own ambitions, their navies prowling the seas and their merchants vying for the riches of the world. What unfolded during this century would determine not only the future of Britain's empire, but the shape of the global order itself. At home, Britain was itself undergoing transformations. The Union of 1707 brought Scotland formally into a political union with England, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. This was no minor administrative act. It represented the forging of a new political entity whose resources, population, and military manpower could now be marshaled together. Scottish merchants and entrepreneurs would soon pour into the empire, particularly in North America and the Caribbean, giving the imperial project fresh energy. Yet the century was defined less by bureaucratic paperwork and more by the clash of arms. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, drew Britain into the struggle to check French and Spanish power. When the dust settled, Britain had gained Gibraltar and Minorca, as well as the Aegean to the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. These acquisitions may have seemed minor at first, but Gibraltar became a permanent keystone of Britain's Mediterranean presence, while the Asiento tied Britain's merchants even more firmly to the brutal machinery of the transatlantic slave trade. The slave trade expanded on a staggering scale. British ships carried hundreds of thousands of Africans across the Atlantic in appalling conditions, their labor sustaining the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. These plantations were some of the most profitable enterprises in the empire, enriching merchants in Bristol, Liverpool, and London. The human cost, however, was catastrophic. Millions torn from their homes, families shattered, and lives cut short in the fields of Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. The wealth of Britain's rising global power was built upon this suffering, though it was seldom acknowledged by those who profited. In North America, Britain's colonies stretched along the Atlantic seaboard, their populations swelling with immigrants from Britain, Ireland, and Germany. They were becoming increasingly self-sufficient, cultivating tobacco, rice, and indigo for export, while small towns and cities flourished on the coast. These colonies were tied to Britain by trade and allegiance to the crown, yet their growing confidence foreshadowed tensions to come. The middle decades of the 18th century were marked by almost continuous war with France. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and, more decisively, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, became global conflicts in which Britain's fate as an imperial power hung in the balance. The 7 Years' War, often described as the first true World War, saw fighting not only in Europe but in the Caribbean, North America, West Africa, and India. In North America, this conflict was known as the French and Indian War. British forces, alongside colonial militias, fought French troops and their indigenous allies for dominance over the Ohio Valley and beyond. After years of brutal fighting, Britain emerged triumphant, seizing control of Canada and all French territories east of the Mississippi. For the first time, Britain held sway over nearly the entire eastern half of North America, dramatically reshaping the balance of power. Meanwhile, in India, the war brought even more profound changes. The East India Company, once a trading corporation clinging to coastal enclaves, began to wield military power. Its private armies, led by men like Robert Clive, defeated French rivals and their Indian allies at battles such as Plassey in 1757. This victory secured Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India, and opened the door to further expansion. The company's transformation into a territorial power was underway, with consequences that would reverberate across South Asia for centuries. Britain's naval supremacy was crucial to these victories. The Royal Navy, expanded and disciplined, became the empire's backbone. Control of sea lanes allowed Britain to move troops, blockade enemy ports, and protect merchant shipping. The Navy was not just a military force, but an economic weapon, ensuring that British trade flourished while rivals faltered. By the century's end, the idea of Britain as the world's foremost naval power was firmly entrenched. Yet the empire was not built without strains. The wars were costly, leaving Britain deeply in debt. Attempts to tax the American colonies to recoup expenses provoked fierce resistance. Colonists who had once proudly fought under the British flag now bristled at what they saw as arbitrary impositions. Within little more than a decade after the triumphs of the 7 Years' War, Britain would face the crisis of the American Revolution. The 18th century also witnessed a growing debate about the morality of slavery. While plantation owners and merchants defended the trade as essential, voices of opposition began to emerge. Quakers, Enlightenment thinkers, and early abolitionists questioned how a nation that prided itself on liberty could sanction such cruelty. Though abolition was still decades away, the seeds of controversy had been sown, and the tension between profit and principle would shadow the empire. By the close of the 18th century, the British Empire had expanded dramatically. It stretched from the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the forests of Canada, from trading forts in Africa to growing dominions in India. Its navy dominated the oceans, its merchants grew wealthy from global commerce, and its influence touched nearly every continent. But beneath the triumph lay contradictions. The very expansion that made Britain powerful also strained its finances, alienated its colonies, and exposed the brutality at the empire's core. The 18th century was therefore a turning point. Britain had not yet achieved the global dominance it would enjoy in the 19th century, but it had secured the foundations. Its rivals had been checked, its naval power was unrivaled, and its territories spanned the globe. The empire had become not merely a collection of scattered colonies, but a central force in world affairs. Still, as the century closed, new challenges loomed. In North America, the spark of revolution threatened to sever Britain's colonies. In France, revolution and war would soon convulse Europe and redraw the map once more. In India, the East India Company's growing power was sowing seeds of corruption and unrest. The British Empire had ascended, but it was entering a new age of turbulence that would test its resilience like never before. When historians call India the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, they are not indulging in metaphor alone. For nearly 2 centuries, India was the beating heart of Britain's global power, the source of immense wealth, prestige, and influence. But this jewel was acquired not through inevitability or accident, but through a peculiar mixture of corporate ambition, military conquest, and political opportunism. Its story reveals how a private trading company became a sovereign power, how Britain transformed India's economy and society, and how the people of India resisted, adapted, and endured under foreign domination. To understand this chapter, we must return to the mid-18th century, when the Mughal Empire, once the most powerful dynasty in South Asia, was fragmenting. For 2 centuries, the Mughals had presided over a vast and sophisticated state, ruling from Delhi across an empire that stretched from Bengal in the east to the Deccan in the south. Their court dazzled European visitors with its wealth, architecture, and culture. But by the early 1700s, the empire was straining. Provincial governors asserted independence, regional powers like the Marathas rose in prominence, and European companies lingered along the coasts, watching carefully for openings. It was in this climate of fragmentation that the East India Company, chartered in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I as a joint stock corporation, made its move. At first, the company's ambitions were commercial, not territorial. Its merchants wanted pepper, silk, indigo, and above all, Indian cotton textiles, which were coveted across Europe. Company settlements at Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta were trading outposts, not fortresses of empire. Yet as Mughal authority waned, the company's military resources, originally raised for defense, became tools for expansion. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. Here, Robert Clive, a company officer, led British and Indian troops to victory against the Nawab of Bengal, aided by the treachery of local elites who switched sides at a critical moment. With Plassey, the East India Company secured Bengal, one of the richest provinces in the world. It was not just another territory. Bengal was the hub of textile production, fertile agriculture, and a thriving internal market. Overnight, the company shifted from a merchant enterprise to a territorial power, extracting land revenue, controlling trade, and dictating terms to rulers who once dwarfed it in scale. This shift from commerce to conquest reshaped both India and Britain. The company's coffers swelled with Bengal's resources, fueling Britain's wars in Europe and its industrial expansion at home. Textiles from Bengal poured into world markets, but increasingly under British monopoly. At the same time, company officials, many of them young men of modest origins, returned to Britain with staggering fortunes, the infamous nabobs, whose wealth distorted politics and society in London. Britain's aristocracy looked on with suspicion, but its economy was enriched beyond measure. Yet this conquest came at an immense cost for the Indians. Bengal's economy, integrated into the demands of company profit, shifted toward cash crops like indigo and opium. When famine struck in 1770, over 10 million people died in one of the worst human disasters of the 18th century. The company continued to demand revenues, indifferent to the suffering of those who could not pay. Famines became a recurring feature of British India, exposing the limits of imperial modernization and the extractive nature of its rule. The British Parliament, alarmed by both the company's corruption and its growing political power, moved to assert control. The Regulating Act of 1773 and the India Act of 1784 brought the company under closer supervision. Yet these reforms did not dismantle company sovereignty. Instead, they cemented a strange hybrid system, a private corporation ruling millions, backed by the British state, but with its own army, treasury, and bureaucracy. It was an empire by proxy, an empire outsourced to a boardroom in London. Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the company expanded further. Mysore, under the leadership of Tipu Sultan, resisted fiercely. Tipu modernized his army, allied with the French, and became a symbol of anti-colonial defiance. But after 4 Anglo-Mysore wars, Mysore was subdued. The Marathas, too, fell in a series of bitter conflicts, leaving most of India's heartland under company control. By the early 1800s, the East India Company ruled vast territories directly, while maintaining treaties with hundreds of princely states' local rulers who kept their thrones but were subordinate to British power. This dual system, known as the Subsidiary Alliance, forced rulers to accept British residence, maintain company troops, and cede foreign policy control. India was not yet a colony in the strictest sense. It was a patchwork of direct control and indirect influence. But the effect was unmistakable. Sovereignty had shifted decisively from Indian hands to foreign merchants turned rulers. With conquest came cultural and social transformation. Missionaries, educators, and administrators debated how to reshape Indian society. Some, like Lord Macaulay, sought to create an English-educated Indian elite through Western schools and the English language. Others promoted Christian evangelism, challenging Hindu and Muslim traditions. Railways, telegraphs, and canals were built, hailed as symbols of modernity. Yet these infrastructures often served British needs more than Indian ones, moving troops swiftly or transporting raw materials to ports for export. Amid these changes, resentment grew. Economic disruption impoverished artisans and weavers who once dominated global textile markets, now undercut by Britain's industrial mills. Heavy taxation and land revenue systems placed crushing burdens on peasants. Cultural interference, from banning sati, the ritual burning of widows, to introducing cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, bred suspicion and anger. In 1857, this resentment exploded. What began as a mutiny among Indian sepoy soldiers in the Company's army spread into a vast uprising. Sepoys at Meerut, refusing to bite cartridges that violated religious taboos, rebelled and marched to Delhi. Soon, discontented princes, peasants, and urban groups joined in. The uprising was not uniform. Some regions remained loyal, others resisted with fury. In Delhi, rebels proclaimed the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II as a symbolic figurehead. Across northern and central India, British garrisons were besieged, civilians attacked, and a brutal struggle unfolded. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, called the First War of Independence by some, was eventually crushed with ferocity. The British retook Delhi, executed rebels, and committed massacres in reprisal. The scale of violence shocked Britain and India alike, leaving scars that endured for generations. But the rebellion achieved one irreversible change. It ended company rule. In 1858, the British Crown assumed direct control over India. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation promising religious tolerance, equal protection under the law, and a commitment to India's welfare. Yet behind the language of benevolence lay the continuation of an extractive system. India was now the most prized possession of the British state itself, governed by the Indian Civil Service, protected by the British Indian Army, and integrated into the empire's global strategy. This Crown Raj brought both new developments and new burdens. Railways expanded dramatically, weaving India into a single economic unit. The telegraph bound the subcontinent to London, transmitting news in hours rather than months. Universities were established in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, nurturing a new generation of English-speaking Indians. Yet the same period saw devastating famines in 1876 to 78, and millions starved as grain was exported abroad. Critics like Dadabhai Naoroji denounced the drain of wealth, arguing that India's riches were being siphoned to Britain, leaving its people impoverished. Politically, the Raj was a paradox. On one hand, it presented itself as a modernizing, reforming regime, proud of its legal codes and administrative efficiency. On the other hand, it was authoritarian, dismissive of Indian aspirations, and rigidly racial in its hierarchy. Indians could serve in the army and bureaucracy, but the highest ranks were reserved for Britons. Yet even under this hierarchy, seeds of nationalism were planted. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, began as a forum for moderate reform but grew into the heart of independence struggles in the 20th century. Poets, thinkers, and reformers from Rabindranath Tagore to Swami Vivekananda wove together critiques of empire with visions of renewal. For Britain, India was indispensable. It supplied cotton for Lancashire's mills, soldiers for Britain's wars, and revenues that funded imperial expansion. Control of India also gave Britain strategic dominance in Asia, securing routes to the Middle East and beyond. To rule India was to rule the key to the empire. But for Indians, the Raj was a daily negotiation of resistance and accommodation, suffering and survival, adaptation and defiance. Some found opportunity in education, commerce, or service under the British. Many more endured exploitation, poverty, and subjugation. The jewel in the crown sparkled brightly for Britain, but it drew its brilliance from the lives and labor of millions who lived under its shadow. The story of India under the Company and the Crown is thus not one of a passive jewel resting in imperial hands, but of a contested space, full of resilience, tragedy, and transformation. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the contradictions of empire were most vivid, between modernity and exploitation, reform and repression, loyalty and rebellion. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, those contradictions would only deepen, setting the stage for India to move from the heart of empire to the forefront of its unraveling. By the dawn of the 19th century, Africa was not the blank canvas that European maps so arrogantly suggested. It was a continent of ancient kingdoms and powerful empires, diverse peoples and cultures, vast trade networks that stretched across deserts and along coasts. The Ashanti in West Africa, the Zulu in the south, the Sokoto Caliphate in the north, these were not passive or isolated societies, but dynamic powers in their own right. Yet in European capitals, Africa was increasingly seen not as a place of sovereign states, but as a field for imperial expansion. For Britain, the early 19th century marked a profound transformation in its relationship with Africa. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and of slavery in the British Empire in 1833 had closed one of the darkest chapters of Britain's imperial history. For centuries, British merchants had profited immensely from trafficking enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Now, abolitionists celebrated a moral triumph. But Britain's retreat from the slave trade did not mean a retreat from Africa. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase, one in which Britain sought to dominate Africa not through human cargo, but through direct territorial control, commerce, and extraction. The Royal Navy became an enforcer of this new policy, patrolling the West African coast to suppress illegal slave trading. Yet even as Britain claimed a humanitarian mission, its presence established a foothold for new imperial ventures. Sierra Leone, founded as a colony for freed slaves, became a base for naval operations and missionary activity. The settlement of Freetown symbolized Britain's shifting role, no longer a trafficker in bondage, but a self-declared guardian of civilization. Still, Britain's moral posture masked economic ambitions. Palm oil, ivory, gold, and later rubber and minerals, these became the commodities that drew British interest deeper into Africa. For much of the early 19th century, British involvement was confined to coastal enclaves and trade posts. Inland Africa remained largely unknown to Europeans, its geography poorly mapped and its politics poorly understood. That began to change with the rise of explorers. Men like David Livingstone became famous for their journeys into the interior, mapping rivers, documenting landscapes, and writing accounts that captured the imagination of the British public. Livingstone spoke of Christianity, commerce, and civilization as the three pillars of Africa's future under European guidance. His reports fed both missionary zeal and imperial ambition. But exploration alone could not account for what followed. The real catalyst for the scramble for Africa lay in the late 19th century, in the convergence of industrial capitalism, geopolitical rivalry, and shifting ideologies of empire. Europe's Industrial Revolution created a ravenous appetite for raw materials, cotton, copper, tin, coal, and rubber. At the same time, manufacturers needed new markets to absorb their goods. Africa's resources and its supposed untapped consumer base offered tantalizing prospects. The scramble was not uniquely British. It was a European phenomenon. France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy all joined the race. But Britain, with its naval supremacy and its established empire in India, was determined to secure a dominant role. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 intensified this determination. Suddenly, the canal provided a direct link between Britain and India, shortening voyages dramatically. Whoever controlled Egypt and the Suez Canal controlled the lifeline of the British Empire. When a financial crisis struck Egypt in the 1870s, Britain stepped in. By 1882, British forces occupied Egypt, claiming to safeguard order but effectively turning it into a protectorate. From this moment, Britain's involvement in Africa accelerated dramatically. The watershed came with the Berlin Conference of 1884–85. Convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, it brought together European powers to negotiate rules for partitioning Africa. No Africans were invited. Around a table in Berlin, diplomats drew borders across maps, dividing territories with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities. Britain emerged from the conference with ambitions for a vast stretch of territory, a vision of a Cape to Cairo axis, connecting its possessions in southern Africa to Egypt in the north. Implementing this vision required both diplomacy and war. In West Africa, Britain expanded from coastal outposts in Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, and Nigeria into the hinterlands. The Ashanti Empire, a formidable state with a sophisticated military, resisted fiercely. 4 Anglo-Ashanti wars were fought between 1824 and 1901, marked by devastating campaigns and shifting fortunes. Ultimately, superior British firepower and persistent pressure subdued the Ashanti, bringing what is now Ghana under colonial rule. In southern Africa, conflict was even more protracted. The British had established a foothold at the Cape in 1806, wresting it from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. But the region's politics were complex. Dutch-descended settlers, known as Boers or Afrikaners, resented British control, particularly after the abolition of slavery. Many trekked inland during the Great Trek, establishing republics like the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. British expansion collided not only with Boer interests but also with powerful African states. The Zulu Kingdom, under leaders like Shaka and Cetshwayo, resisted British encroachment with a formidable military organization. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 produced both humiliating British defeats, most famously at Isenelwana, and eventual British victory after reinforcements overwhelmed the Zulu. These wars were brutal, revealing the asymmetry of imperial conquest. African armies fought with courage and strategy, but Britain's industrial-era weaponry, rifles, artillery, and later, the Maxim gun, tilted the balance. In East Africa, the pattern repeated. Britain established protectorates over Kenya and Uganda, constructing railways from the coast to the interior. The labor was grueling, the costs immense, but the strategic payoff was clear. These territories secured Britain's influence around Lake Victoria and checked German ambitions in the region. Nigeria became another keystone of British Africa. Rich in palm oil and other resources, its diverse communities, House of Fulani in the north, Yoruba in the west, and Igbo in the east, were brought under colonial rule through a combination of treaties, wars, and indirect governance. British administrators relied heavily on existing structures, particularly Islamic emirates in the north, to maintain control. This policy of indirect rule, associated with Lord Lugard, became a hallmark of British strategy, governing through local rulers who answered to colonial officials. In all these territories, the rhetoric of empire presented Britain as a bearer of progress and civilization. Railways, schools, and courts were introduced. Missionaries spread Christianity, often undermining traditional religions. The English language and British legal codes reshaped societies. But beneath these claims of uplift lay a stark reality: economic exploitation. Colonies were reorganized to serve Britain's needs. Cash crops replaced subsistence farming, leaving communities vulnerable to famine. Taxes forced Africans into wage labor, often on terms that benefited settlers or colonial companies. Resistance was met with violence. The Boer Wars, 1880–81, 1899–1902, epitomized the contradictions of Britain's African empire. The second conflict, triggered by disputes over gold and diamond fields in the Transvaal, became a long and bitter struggle. The British deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, scorched earth tactics, and concentration camps for Boer civilians camps in which thousands of women and children perished. Britain ultimately prevailed, but at a heavy moral and political cost. The war revealed that even against European settlers, Britain's imperial machine relied on overwhelming force and ruthless methods. By the turn of the century, Britain commanded an African empire stretching from Egypt to South Africa, from Nigeria to Kenya. Yet these borders were arbitrary, often cutting across ethnic and cultural lines. Communities once connected were divided, while rivals were forced into uneasy coexistence under a single colonial administration. The legacy of these borders still haunts Africa today, fueling conflicts and divisions that can be traced directly to the partitioning of the continent in the 19th century. For Africans, life under British rule was a spectrum of experiences. Some elites found opportunity in colonial service or Western education. Missionary schools produced figures who would later lead nationalist movements. Others endured dispossession, forced labor, or cultural suppression. Land was seized for settlers in Kenya and Rhodesia, displacing indigenous populations. Traditional authority structures were co-opted or undermined, eroding the fabric of local governance. Yet resistance never disappeared. From the Ashanti Wars to Zulu uprisings, from Kenyan struggles against land seizure to Nigerian protests against taxation, Africans continually challenged imperial power. These acts of defiance were often localized and fragmented, but they laid the groundwork for the organized nationalist movements of the 20th century. For Britain, Africa was both an opportunity and a burden. Its colonies provided raw materials, markets, and strategic bases. Control of the Suez Canal secured routes to India and the Far East. Diamonds and gold from South Africa enriched investors and fueled industrial growth. But holding this vast empire demanded constant expenditure of military and administrative resources. The very scale of Britain's African possessions sowed seeds of vulnerability. Maintaining dominance across such a vast and restless continent was never guaranteed. The scramble for Africa, then, was not just a story of conquest. It was a story of arrogance and hubris, of borders drawn in ignorance, of societies transformed by force. It revealed the contradictions of the British Empire in its starkest form, proclaiming civilization while unleashing devastation, building railways while uprooting communities, and abolishing slavery while creating new forms of economic coercion. By 1900, Britain was the greatest imperial power in Africa, its flag planted from Cairo to Cape Town. But beneath the map's confident red shading, tensions simmered. Africans had not been silenced. Their resistance, though crushed in the 19th century, would re-emerge in the 20th century with renewed strength. And Britain, though triumphant, had inherited not only vast territories, but also deep responsibilities and latent crises. The scramble had secured Britain's place in Africa, but it had also set the stage for struggles that would one day unravel the empire itself. The year 1815 marked a turning point in the history of Britain and the wider world. Napoleon Bonaparte, the great disruptor of Europe, was finally defeated at Waterloo. On that battlefield, Britain secured not only its place among the victors, but also its position as the preeminent global power. From this moment until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Britain would dominate international trade, finance, and diplomacy. It was a period historians call Pax Britannica, the British peace. Yet behind the surface of stability and imperial grandeur lay contradictions, inequalities, and fragilities that would later bring the empire to its knees. After 1815, Britain emerged from decades of war with France as the strongest naval and commercial power on Earth. Its fleets controlled the sea lanes, ensuring that Britain could move goods, troops, and influence across every ocean. With rivals defeated or contained, London became the beating heart of global finance. The City of London evolved into the world's premier financial hub, with British banks extending credit to governments, merchants, and investors worldwide. The gold standard, centered on Britain's currency, anchored international finance. British insurance houses underwrote global trade, while the London Stock Exchange grew into the clearinghouse of the empire. Merchant capital, tied closely to imperial shipping, turned Britain into the so-called workshop of the world. The 19th century was also an age of profound industrial change. Britain's factories, powered by steam engines and fed by coal, produced textiles, machinery, and iron goods on an unprecedented scale. The Industrial Revolution and the empire fed one another in a cycle of growth. Cotton, grown by enslaved laborers in the American South and later in India and Egypt, flowed into Manchester's mills. Jute from Bengal was woven into sacks for grain and coal. Tea from Ceylon and Assam, sugar from the Caribbean, wool from Australia, and meat from New Zealand filled British shops. The empire was not just a source of raw materials, it was a captive market. Colonies were expected to consume British manufactures, ensuring steady demand for industrial goods. Yet this global system came at enormous human cost. Industrialization devastated India's textile industry, once the envy of the world. Weavers who had thrived under the Mughal Empire were impoverished by the flood of cheap Manchester cotton. In Africa, Britain's demand for palm oil and other raw materials drew entire communities into exploitative trade networks. Behind the prosperity of London and Liverpool stood the immiseration of millions abroad. Britain's dominance rested above all on the Royal Navy. At its height, it was larger than the next two navies combined. Steam power, ironclads, and advanced gunnery gave Britain overwhelming firepower. The Navy was not just a defensive shield, but an instrument of coercion. When local rulers resisted British demands, gunboats appeared offshore. Ports were bombarded, rulers deposed, and treaties imposed. This practice became known as gunboat diplomacy. It was used in Latin America to secure debts, in China to force open markets, and in Africa to intimidate coastal chiefs. The mere presence of a British warship could bend governments to London's will. Control of strategic choke points cemented this power. Gibraltar, Malta, the Cape Colony, Aden, and later the Suez Canal gave Britain bases along the arteries of world trade. The empire was stitched together by coaling stations, docks, and telegraph cables, all guarded by the Navy's guns. During this long 19th century, the British Empire expanded dramatically. In India, the East India Company's dominion collapsed in 1857 with the outbreak of the Indian Rebellion. Though the revolt was brutally suppressed, it changed everything. The company was dissolved, and India was placed under direct rule of the crown. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, cementing the jewel of the empire. In China, Britain fought two Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, to force open Chinese markets to British merchants. The humiliating treaties that followed gave Britain control of Hong Kong, access to treaty ports, and vast profits from the opium trade. These wars marked the beginning of what the Chinese later called the Century of Humiliation. In Africa, Britain joined the so-called Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. Explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley paved the way, while Cecil Rhodes and other imperialists sought to link colonies from Cairo to Cape Town. British forces clashed with the Zulu, fought the Ashanti, and engaged in protracted wars with the Boers. Each conquest was justified as spreading civilization and Christianity, yet at its core lay the hunger for land, minerals, and labor. This was also the age of imperial ideology. Victorians convinced themselves that the empire was a civilizing mission. Writers and politicians spoke of the white man's burden, a duty to govern lesser races. Missionaries carried the Bible to Africa and Asia, while colonial administrators promoted English education and Western law. But this ideology masked exploitation. Colonized peoples were often excluded from political power, their cultures disparaged, their economies reshaped to serve Britain's needs. Yet imperial ideology was powerful because it offered moral justification for the empire at home. It reassured the British public that domination was not greed but benevolence. Despite Britain's confidence, resistance was constant. Indian rebels in 1857, the Zulu warriors at Issawana in 1879, and the Sudanese Mahdist at Khartoum in 1885 all showed that the empire was contested. In Ireland, nationalist agitation grew throughout the 19th century, challenging the legitimacy of union with Britain. At home, critics of the empire emerged. Some objected on humanitarian grounds, condemning slavery, forced labor, or imperial wars. The abolitionist movement had already forced the end of the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in the 1830s. Others, like the economist J. A. Hobson, argued that imperialism served only financiers and industrialists, not the ordinary Briton. Still, imperial patriotism was widespread. The empire was celebrated in exhibitions, novels, and popular culture. Children read tales of adventure in distant lands, while maps shaded in red proclaimed Britain's global reach. By 1900, Britain ruled over 1/4 of the Earth's land and population. The 19th century was a golden age for Britain, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Industrial competitors rose. The United States and Germany challenged Britain's economic supremacy. In Asia, Japan emerged as a modern power, defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. At the same time, the costs of empire grew. Administering vast territories required armies, railways, and bureaucracies. Colonial conflicts drained resources and exposed vulnerabilities. The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, revealed how difficult and costly it could be to impose British rule, even against relatively small settler communities. Internationally, Britain's isolation became precarious. By the early 20th century, German naval expansion and European rivalries threatened the very Pax Britannica Britain had created. The long 19th century was both the zenith and the beginning of decline for the British Empire. Britain stood astride the world, its navy supreme, its industries unmatched, its colonies vast. Yet the very forces that built this empire, industrial competition, colonial resistance, and geopolitical rivalries, would soon erode its foundations. The Pax Britannica was not truly peace, but a dominance enforced by gunboats, treaties, and financial muscle. It created wealth and global connections, but also sowed resentment and inequality. As the 20th century dawned, the empire's contradictions grew sharper, setting the stage for the cataclysm of the First World War. From 1815 to 1914, the British Empire reached its greatest extent. But history teaches us that empires are never eternal. The story of this century was not just one of triumph and grandeur, but also of seeds of decline quietly taking root beneath the red banners of empire. In August 1914, as the guns of Europe thundered into action, the British Empire seemed unshakable. Its red patches stretched across the globe, from the Caribbean to Canada, from India to Australia, from Africa to the Pacific Islands. The Royal Navy remained supreme, and London still governed the flow of world finance. But war, when it came, would shake the empire to its core. For 30 years, from 1914 until 1945, Britain was embroiled in two of the deadliest conflicts in human history. These wars drained its wealth, undermined its confidence, and transformed its relationship with its colonies. They did not destroy the empire in an instant, but they fatally weakened it, setting in motion the processes that would lead to decolonization. When war broke out in 1914, Britain drew upon the empire to an unprecedented degree. Troops from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand joined the fight. The Indian Army, numbering over 1 million men by the war's end, fought on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, and in East Africa. Australians and New Zealanders stormed the cliffs at Gallipoli. Canadians fought at Vimy Ridge. In Africa, African soldiers and porters were conscripted into long campaigns against German colonies. The war was framed as a struggle for civilization, but for many colonized peoples, it raised difficult questions. Why should they die for freedoms that they did not enjoy at home? Promises were made of reform, of self-government, of gratitude. Yet after the war, most of these promises were betrayed. Economically, the First World War shattered Britain's financial supremacy. Large loans were taken from the United States to fund the war effort. By 1918, Britain was transformed from the world's creditor to one of its greatest debtors. The war also disrupted trade networks, destroyed markets, and drained the gold reserves that had sustained the pound sterling as the global currency. The psychological impact was equally severe. A generation of young men had been slaughtered in the trenches, leaving scars on British society. The old sense of invincibility had been lost. Britain emerged victorious, but it was a victory bought at staggering cost. The aftermath of the war saw the empire stretched, but also enlarged. Germany's colonies in Africa and the Pacific were distributed as League of Nations mandates, with Britain assuming control of territories such as Tanganyika, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. The empire had never been larger. Yet beneath the surface, it was less secure than ever. In India, the war had intensified calls for self-government. Leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi mobilized mass movements of protest, demanding that Britain honor its wartime promises of reform. Instead, colonial authorities responded with repression. The 1919 Amritsar massacre, in which British troops gunned down hundreds of unarmed protesters, sent shockwaves through India and delegitimized British rule in the eyes of millions. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 and the subsequent War of Independence shattered Britain's hold on its oldest colony. By 1921, Ireland was partitioned, with the South gaining independence as the Irish Free State. For the first time in centuries, Britain's empire was shrinking in Europe itself. Across Africa and the Caribbean, veterans returned from the war questioning the justice of the empire. They had fought for Britain's survival, but they returned to poverty, racial discrimination, and unfulfilled promises. Anti-colonial movements, still weak in the 1920s, began to gather strength. The 1920s and 1930s were marked by economic turbulence. The Great Depression of 1929 struck Britain hard, undermining its exports and forcing cuts in imperial spending. Meanwhile, new rivals were rising. The United States had overtaken Britain as the world's leading industrial power. Japan was emerging as a formidable naval force in the Pacific. Germany, humiliated at Versailles, seethed with resentment and prepared for revenge. Britain attempted to shore up its empire through the imperial preference system, creating a trading bloc that prioritized commerce within the empire. But this was a defensive strategy, a recognition that Britain could no longer dominate the world economy as it once had. Culturally, too, the image of empire was changing. The interwar years saw both heightened celebration of imperial grandeur with exhibitions, royal tours, and schoolbooks glorifying Britain's global role and the growth of dissent. Writers, intellectuals, and activists increasingly questioned whether the empire was sustainable, moral, or even desirable. In 1939, Britain once again found itself at war with Germany. This time, the struggle would prove even more devastating. Once again, Britain mobilized the empire. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. African regiments served in East Africa and Burma. Troops from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand joined the campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. The empire was essential to Britain's survival. Yet the Second World War also revealed Britain's weakness. France fell in 1940, leaving Britain to fight on alone until the United States and the Soviet Union joined the conflict. The empire became Britain's lifeline, but it also became a burden. Defending far-flung territories stretched resources thin. Singapore, long considered an impregnable fortress, fell to the Japanese in 1942, dealing a humiliating blow to British prestige in Asia. The war accelerated Britain's economic decline. By its end, Britain was bankrupt, sustained only by massive American loans and the generosity of the Lend-Lease program. The pound sterling lost its global dominance, while Washington displaced London as the center of world finance. Most critically, the war unleashed a surge of anti-colonial nationalism. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia shattered the myth of European invincibility. Colonized peoples saw that Western powers could be defeated. In India, Gandhi's Quit India movement demanded immediate independence. In Africa, future leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta were inspired by wartime service to press for self-rule. During the war, Britain signed the Atlantic Charter with the United States in 1941. This document, crafted by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, declared that all peoples had the right to self-determination. Churchill saw it as a statement against Nazi conquest, but colonized peoples saw it as a promise for themselves. If Poles, Czechs, and Norwegians deserved freedom, why not Indians, Ghanaians, or Malays? The contradiction was glaring. Britain claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy, yet it still ruled hundreds of millions of subjects without consent. This moral inconsistency eroded Britain's legitimacy and strengthened the arguments of anti-colonial leaders. When victory came in 1945, Britain celebrated, but the empire had been transformed. 2 world wars in 30 years had left Britain victorious but exhausted. Its economy was shattered, its cities bombed, its treasury empty. American loans kept the country afloat, but at the price of dependence. The United States now dictated the terms of global finance and diplomacy. The empire, still vast on paper, was already crumbling in reality. In 1947, India would gain independence, followed by a wave of decolonization across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The Second World War did not end the empire overnight, but it ensured that Britain could no longer hold it together. In 1945, Britain stood among the victors of the Second World War. Winston Churchill had proclaimed the triumph of freedom over tyranny, and the Union Jack flew proudly across territories spanning every continent. On maps, the empire remained vast: colonies in Africa, dominions in the Pacific, possessions in the Caribbean, and, most importantly, the sprawling subcontinent of India. But the war had changed everything. Victory had come at immense cost, not only in blood, but in treasure, prestige, and willpower. The empire that had once seemed eternal was now fragile, exposed, and under pressure from all sides. The cracks in its armor were widening, and within a single generation, they would become impossible to contain. The Second World War had drained Britain's reserves of power. Economically, the nation was left bankrupt, reliant on loans from the United States, and tethered to American financial policy. Sterling, once the global reserve currency, wavered under the weight of debt. Cities like London, Coventry, and Liverpool bore the scars of bombing. Industry struggled to rebuild amid rationing and austerity. The empire had been crucial to survival during the war, but it had also exposed Britain's dependence on its colonies. Millions of Indian, African, and Caribbean soldiers had fought under the Union Jack. Colonies had supplied food, raw materials, and manpower, binding themselves to Britain's war effort. Now those same people asked, if we could fight and die for Britain, why could we not govern ourselves? The first great fracture came quickly. India, the so-called jewel in the crown, had long been central to the empire's wealth and prestige. But by 1945, Britain could no longer hold it. Nationalist movements had grown in strength throughout the 20th century, led by the Indian National Congress and figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. Gandhi's campaigns of nonviolent resistance, coupled with mass civil disobedience, had made colonial rule untenable. The war had only intensified the pressure. The Quit India movement of 1942 called for immediate independence, while the Indian National Army, led by Subhas Chandra Bose, fought alongside the Japanese in Southeast Asia. By 1947, Britain faced mounting unrest, spiraling communal violence, and the urgent realization that it no longer had the resources to impose its will. In August 1947, India achieved independence, but it came at a devastating cost. The partition divided the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, sparking one of the largest migrations in human history. Millions of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs fled across new borders, and violence claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Britain's departure was hurried and chaotic, a retreat rather than a dignified handover. For many, it symbolized the beginning of the end of the empire. India's independence inspired movements across Asia. In Burma, Myanmar, and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, independence followed swiftly in 1948. In Malaya, however, Britain clung to power, determined to hold on to its lucrative rubber and tin industries. But even here, the post-war world intervened. The Malayan emergency erupted in 1948 as communist guerrillas launched an armed struggle against British rule. It would take 12 years of brutal counterinsurgency to suppress the rebellion, and although Malaya remained under British control until 1957, the struggle exposed the fragility of colonial rule in the face of determined resistance. In the Middle East, Britain sought to maintain its presence, particularly in Palestine and Egypt. Yet both regions quickly slipped from its grasp. In Palestine, Britain found itself trapped between Jewish and Arab aspirations. Violence escalated, culminating in Britain's withdrawal in 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel. In Egypt, nationalist resentment at Britain's continued military presence around the Suez Canal boiled over. Though Britain attempted to maintain control, the tide of anti-colonialism was rising too fast. Nowhere was Britain's declining power more dramatically revealed than in the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital artery of global trade, and a linchpin of Britain's route to India and the East, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military intervention. At first, the operation seemed successful. British and French forces seized control of the canal zone, but the political fallout was catastrophic. The United States, under President Eisenhower, refused to support the invasion. Facing economic pressure and diplomatic isolation, Britain was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. Suez was more than a military setback. It was a revelation. Britain could no longer act as a global power without American consent. The age of unilateral imperial adventures was over. The world had entered a new bipolar order, dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. For Britain, Suez marked the symbolic end of the empire, a moment when the illusion of supremacy was shattered beyond repair. As Britain staggered from Suez, attention shifted to Africa, where nationalist movements were gathering strength. In 1957, Ghana, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence. Its success electrified the continent, inspiring a wave of decolonization. Nigeria, with its vast population and resources, followed in 1960. Kenya, scarred by the brutal Mau Mau uprising, achieved independence in 1963 after years of violent struggle and repression. In Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and in other settler colonies, the path was slower and bloodier, but the trajectory was clear. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan acknowledged the inevitability of this transformation in his famous 1960 Wind of Change speech in Cape Town. He admitted that the winds of change were sweeping through Africa and that Britain could not resist them. It was a public recognition that the empire was no longer sustainable. In the Caribbean, too, the empire retreated. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago gained independence in 1962, followed by Barbados, Guyana, and others through the 1960s and 1970s. The West Indies Federation, an attempt to preserve unity, collapsed, leaving each island to pursue its own path. In the Pacific, colonies like Fiji, Tonga, and Papua New Guinea would eventually follow, though in the 1940s and 50s they remained under British oversight. Even in the Mediterranean, Britain's grip weakened. Cyprus erupted into violence in the 1950s, leading to independence in 1960. Malta would follow in 1964. Gibraltar and the Falklands remained, but they were remnants of an empire that was rapidly fading. As colonies gained independence, another transformation unfolded within Britain itself. Waves of migrants from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa arrived to rebuild post-war Britain. The Empire Windrush docked in 1948, carrying Caribbean workers to Britain's shores. They came to fill labor shortages, driving buses, working in hospitals, and rebuilding bombed cities. This migration reshaped Britain, making it increasingly multicultural. Yet it also exposed tensions as racism and resentment simmered in parts of British society. The empire was dissolving abroad, but its people, its cultures, and its legacies were arriving in Britain itself, ensuring that imperial history would remain central to Britain's identity long after decolonization. By the 1970s, the British Empire was no longer an empire in any meaningful sense. What remained were scattered dependencies: the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, Hong Kong, and a handful of Caribbean and Pacific territories. London had been replaced by Washington as the center of Western power, and Britain was increasingly preoccupied with Europe, joining the European Economic Community in 1973. The transformation had been astonishingly rapid. In 1945, Britain had ruled over a quarter of the world's population. By the 1970s, that empire was gone. The retreat had been marked by moments of violence in India, in Kenya, and Palestine, but also by negotiated settlements and transfers of power. It was not the cataclysmic collapse of Rome or the Mongols, but a more managed dissolution. Yet the scale of the retreat was no less dramatic. In August 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, it was not just a European state that went to battle. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. From Canada to India, from the Caribbean to Australia, the Union Jack flew over 1/4 of the globe's population and nearly a quarter of its landmass. The entry of Britain into the First World War meant the mobilization of resources, manpower, and loyalty from every corner of this sprawling empire. And yet, within 3 decades of that fateful decision, the empire would stand on the brink of dissolution. The world wars, more than any other forces, accelerated the unraveling of the British imperial project. They drained its financial reserves, exposed its vulnerabilities, and ignited nationalist fires across the colonies. To understand how the empire unraveled, one must trace the twin cataclysms of the First and Second World Wars and how they altered Britain's place in the world irreversibly. At the outset of the First World War, Britain's empire was not merely a backdrop. It was central to the war effort. Indian soldiers marched on the Western Front in France, while troops from Australia and New Zealand landed on the shores of Gallipoli. Canada, South Africa, the Caribbean, and Africa itself provided hundreds of thousands of soldiers and millions of tons of food, raw materials, and industrial resources. For Britain, this global network offered a strategic advantage. Control of the seas allowed the Royal Navy to blockade Germany, while colonial ports provided staging grounds across the oceans. But the war also revealed the fragility of imperial cohesion. The horrific slaughter in the trenches shook colonial faith in the empire's supposed moral superiority. In India, The deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers and the promises of reform that went unfulfilled afterwards strengthened nationalist demands. Economically, the war devastated Britain's financial supremacy. To sustain the conflict, London borrowed heavily from the United States, transforming the empire from a creditor to a debtor nation. This marked a turning point. Britain's ability to bankroll its empire was eroding. The 1920s and 1930s tested the empire's stability. On paper, the British Empire reached its zenith after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Germany's colonies in Africa and the Pacific, along with Ottoman territories in the Middle East, were handed to Britain as League of Nations mandates. Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq were new additions to the empire's already vast reach. Yet this expansion masked deep fractures. Nationalist movements gathered pace. In India, Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent campaigns challenged British rule in a way that brute force could not easily suppress. In Ireland, a bitter war of independence led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, tearing away a piece of Britain's oldest colony. In the Middle East, revolts in Iraq and Palestine foreshadowed the instability that imperial rule would continue to generate. The Great Depression of the 1930s compounded the strain. Economic hardship fueled discontent both at home and abroad. Britain leaned increasingly on its dominions and colonies for trade, but the myth of a united empire was fading. Self-governing dominions like Canada, South Africa, and Australia asserted greater autonomy, codified by the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which granted them legal independence while retaining symbolic ties to the crown. When Hitler's armies invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain again declared war. Once more, the empire mobilized. Millions of Indian soldiers fought across North Africa, Italy, and Southeast Asia. African troops served in Burma and beyond. The dominions committed men and resources with remarkable vigor. Yet beneath the surface, cracks widened. The fall of Singapore in 1942 was a humiliation unlike any other. Singapore had been described as the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress symbolizing British naval dominance. When Japanese forces captured it, tens of thousands of British and Indian troops were taken prisoner. The event shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility and sent shockwaves through Asia. For many in India, Malaya, and Burma, it confirmed that Britain was no longer the unassailable power it once seemed. At the same time, the war tied Britain's survival to the support of the United States. Lend-Lease aid and American military power ensured that Britain could continue the fight. But this dependence came at a price. The United States, itself a former colony, had no interest in sustaining an old-world empire. President Franklin Roosevelt pressed Churchill privately on questions of colonial independence, particularly for India. While Churchill resisted, seeing himself as the guardian of the empire, the geopolitical tide was turning against him. The Second World War brought India's simmering discontent to a boiling point. Without consulting Indian leaders, Britain declared India at war in 1939. This sparked outrage. The Quit India movement of 1942, led by Gandhi, called for immediate British withdrawal. Although the British cracked down harshly, imprisoning tens of thousands, the movement revealed the weakening legitimacy of imperial rule. Meanwhile, Indian soldiers were fighting in some of the most brutal campaigns of the war. From North Africa to Burma, they served in their millions. Their sacrifices deepened the demand for self-government. By the war's end, even Britain's own officials recognized that India could no longer be held by force. The Second World War drained Britain to its core. The empire emerged on the victorious side, but at a terrible cost. London was bombed, the economy was shattered, and debts to the United States were towering. Once again, Britain had mortgaged its empire to survive. Unlike in 1918, this time the financial burden was too great to recover. The empire that emerged in 1945 was outwardly vast, but inwardly hollow. The United States and the Soviet Union had risen as superpowers, dwarfing Britain's global influence. Anti-colonial movements were no longer fringe voices. They were mass movements, armed with the rhetoric of self-determination that echoed the very principles Britain had claimed to defend in the war. Between 1914 and 1945, the British Empire was transformed. Once the world's unrivaled hegemon, it had been humbled by war, weakened by debt, and challenged by the very peoples it claimed to rule. The wars had demonstrated both the extraordinary reach of Britain's global network and the limits of its durability. The First World War shook its foundations. The Second World War brought the edifice crashing down. Within 2 years of the latter's end, India would gain independence. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, decolonization would accelerate with unstoppable momentum. The Great Wars had not just tested the British Empire, they had mortally wounded it. By 1945, the empire still existed in name and structure, but its soul was gone. What remained was the twilight of empire, a slow retreat from power that would shape the second half of the 20th century. In 1945, Britain stood victorious in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. The Union Jack flew above London's rubble-strewn streets as crowds celebrated the defeat of Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill, the wartime prime minister who had vowed never to surrender, spoke proudly of Britain's endurance and the resilience of its empire. Yet behind the victory parades lay a sobering truth. Britain's empire had survived the war, but only in name. Its foundations had been hollowed out by exhaustion, debt, and the rising tide of nationalism. The Second World War marked not the preservation of Britain's imperial system, but its death knell. What followed in the 2 decades after 1945 was a wave of decolonization unparalleled in history. The empire, which had taken centuries to build, began to unravel at breathtaking speed. Colonies once thought integral to Britain's global power slipped away, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in violence and bloodshed. For many in Britain, this period was a reckoning, a confrontation with the reality that the age of empire was over. No single event symbolized the collapse of Britain's empire more than the loss of India. For nearly 2 centuries, the subcontinent had been the crown jewel of British imperialism, a land of immense wealth and manpower. Indian soldiers had fought valiantly in both world wars, and yet by 1945, the demand for independence was irresistible. In February 1947, Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, announced that Britain would grant India independence within 2 years. In truth, Britain had little choice. Its economy was crippled, its authority shaken, and its ability to project power across Asia diminished. The Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, and the Muslim League, under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, pressed for immediate sovereignty. But the transfer of power was not smooth. Deep religious divisions between Hindus and Muslims led to one of the most traumatic events of the 20th century, partition. In August 1947, India and Pakistan were born as separate states. What followed was chaos on a scale few could have imagined. Villages were torn apart, trains full of refugees were attacked, and millions fled their homes in one of the largest migrations in history. Estimates suggest that up to 1 million people died in the violence. For Britain, the departure from India was both an end and a beginning. It marked the loss of the empire's greatest possession, yet it also set the template for the decolonization that would follow. Hurried withdrawals, unresolved conflicts, and the creation of new nations out of the wreckage of imperial rule. The Middle East was another arena where Britain's imperial authority rapidly crumbled. After the First World War, Britain had acquired vast new territories from the defeated Ottoman Empire: Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. These mandates were supposed to prepare the people for self-rule under international supervision, but in reality, they were treated as colonies in all but name. By 1945, the region was already restive. In Palestine, Tensions between Jewish immigrants fleeing Europe and the Arab population escalated into open conflict. Britain, caught in the middle, struggled to maintain order. The violence of the 1940s, the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem by Zionist militants, and the killings of British soldiers convinced many that the situation was untenable. In 1948, Britain withdrew, leaving the newly declared State of Israel to fight for survival in the Arab-Israeli War. Elsewhere, Britain's hold was equally fragile. In 1952, a nationalist coup in Egypt led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the monarchy that had long been allied to Britain. For years later, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, triggering the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a military intervention to retake the canal. Militarily, the campaign succeeded. Politically, it was a disaster. The United States and the Soviet Union both condemned Britain's actions, and under intense pressure from Washington, London was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. The Suez Crisis exposed the reality that Britain was no longer the global power it once had been. If India's independence had marked the symbolic end of empire, Suez confirmed it. Britain was now a junior partner in a world dominated by the superpowers. The most dramatic wave of decolonization came in Africa. At the end of the Second World War, Britain ruled vast territories across the continent, from the Gold Coast to Kenya, from Nigeria to Rhodesia. But within 2 decades, most of these colonies would be independent. Economic shifts played a role. After 1945, the cost of maintaining the empire outweighed the benefits. Britain's economy was focused on rebuilding at home, and the colonies, though rich in raw materials, required investment and administration that Britain could no longer afford. But economics alone did not explain the speed of decolonization. Nationalist movements had taken root across Africa, inspired by global currents of self-determination and often led by Western-educated elites. In the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah galvanized support for independence with his powerful oratory and political organization. In 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from colonial rule. Nkrumah's success reverberated across the continent, inspiring others to follow. Nigeria gained independence in 1960, followed by Tanganyika, later Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya in the years that followed. Kenya's struggle was particularly violent. The Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s saw brutal guerrilla warfare between nationalist fighters and British forces, accompanied by mass detentions and atrocities on both sides. Yet by 1963, Kenya too achieved independence. By the mid-1960s, most of Britain's African empire had vanished. Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, acknowledged this reality in his famous 1960 speech in Cape Town, declaring that the wind of change is blowing through this continent. In the Caribbean, the process of decolonization was slower but inevitable. Britain experimented with federation, attempting to unite its Caribbean colonies into a single state, but the project collapsed in the early 1960s. Instead, colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados achieved independence one by one. Elsewhere, the pattern repeated. In Asia, Burma and Ceylon, Sri Lanka gained independence soon after India. Malaya followed in 1957, after a bitter insurgency against communist guerrillas. In the Pacific, colonies such as Fiji and the Solomon Islands would gain independence later in the 1970s. By the 1960s, the British Empire was effectively gone. What remained was a network of small territories and dependencies, along with a voluntary association known as the Commonwealth of Nations. This body, which grew out of the empire, sought to maintain ties of friendship and cooperation among former colonies. For some, it symbolized a positive legacy of shared history. For others, it was a hollow reminder of imperial domination. For Britain itself, the loss of empire was traumatic. Generations had been raised to believe that the empire was not only Britain's destiny, but its defining purpose. The rapid withdrawal left a sense of uncertainty about the nation's role in the world. Was Britain still a great power, or merely a middle-ranking state in a world dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union?